Sport Business. Global Sports Intelligence.
Hello, and welcome to Inside the Deal, the monthly podcast from Sport Business. My name is Frank Dunn, and I'm the editor-at-large of the Sport Business Group. Each month, I'll be taking an in-depth look at one deal from the industry. It could be a media rights deal, sponsorship, carriage deal, anything, any sector, any vertical. It won't necessarily be the most valuable deal that we've reported on that month, but it will be a deal that we think tells us something interesting about where the industry is today and where it might be heading in the future. This month, we're going to look at a deal that was agreed a couple of weeks ago between Disney and Uefa for the Women's Champions League. So we're going to start with that deal. We're going to turn it upside down. We're going to give it a good shake and we're going to see what falls out of its pockets. But we're also going to use that deal as a starting point to ask some broader questions. We're going to look at the media rights value to the Women's Champions League generally. We're going to look at how that compares with other club competitions in the women's game. We're going to look at what it tells us about UEFA's thinking about achieving the right balance between reach and revenue for the competition. We're going to look at whether or not Disney has finally hit upon a media rights strategy for sport outside of the US. And we're going to make one or two small observations at the end about the media rights value for women's football generally. Now, I'm delighted to be joined today by Imran Yusuf, the newly anointed executive editor of Sport Business and former editor of Sport Business Media, and Maria Koladova, the senior reporter of Sport Business Media. Welcome to you both.
Thanks, Frank.
Thanks, Frank.
Now, let's get right into this. Imran, on September the 19th, you provided an exclusive report, an exclusive breakdown on this deal between Disney and UEFA for the Women's Champions League. So for the benefit of those poor souls that do not subscribe to Sport Business Media, can you bring us up to speed on the nuts and bolts of that deal?
Yes, certainly, Frank. You're right. A couple of weeks ago, the deal was analyzed by us. And I think in May, the deal was announced. But we actually think it was a full year ago now that Disney first expressed its very strong interest in acquiring these rights. They had eyes on these rights for quite some time. We'll get into the timeline later. But for now, as you say, the nuts and bolts. Disney, we've gleaned, are paying an average of around 12 million euros per year. That's the rights for all 75 UEFA Women's Champions League matches per season. That's across Europe. They'll exploit it on their Disney Plus streaming service across the continent. The European Broadcasting Union is also involved, along with some European free-to-air broadcasters who did their deals independently. And they've got free-to-air rights for a total of, we think, in the region of 2 million euros per year. Overall, talking 14 million euros per year for competition media rights in Europe, which is the territory for this property. And that's over the next 5 seasons. So the season will start soon, 25-26, all the way through and including 2029-30. Now that is a big increase. Last time around, the zone last cycle were paying around 7 million euros per season globally. That excludes MENA and China. How did that happen in this era of sort of flatlining media rights? And also, and we'll get into this later, for a property that most people saw as being very much exposure-led, sponsorship-led. Well, taking us back to, as I said, last year, actually at the Sportel Monaco Conference 2024, both Maria and I, during the day, but also at the famous or infamous Irish pub that we'll be at probably in 3 weeks' time, we had some conversations, and actually multiple people we had told us that Disney had made its intentions clear. They wanted these rights. The EBU, meanwhile, we didn't know this then, we found out subsequently, had also informed the seller of the rights to Circles and UEFA that it was there. It wanted to be involved. They knew they'd need to be involved because there would be some free-to-air footprint angle involved in the distribution of these rights. Having said that, it was a long way to go before Disney got these rights. UC3, which is the joint venture between UEFA and the European Club Association, they put out a formal tender, not just in Europe, also the Americas. Bids were due to the start of February, and they put multiple packages available. And in the end, it was, I think, television broadcasters in Europe. That's what we understand. There was competition there. And that's what drove the big increase for Disney to pay around 12 million euros per year. Sky UK, Sky Germany, very interested, we understand. for Disney itself involved in the process. We had initially, it was a couple of territories in Europe. This then expanded to a full global bid. That was very much on the cards. In fact, that's the first thing that we heard back at Sportel last year. Obviously, they sort of retreated from that, and eventually it was a pan-European.
So it's basically doubled in value between one cycle and the next.
It has. In fact, it's more than doubled. We understand it was a very good deal for the property in the US as well. CBS, Paramount Plus paying in the region of around 2.5 million euros per year. So you add that in, that's also a significant deal for them. And actually, I think when we're speaking to people, doing the tender in both the Europe and the Americas helped Two Circles UEFA get more out of the Americas, because there was the sense that a Disney or someone else might go for both. And so CBS and Paramount, I think, put in a pretty strong bid based on the back of.
So in absolute terms, values are not enormous, but the percentage growth is really, really significant. And I'm wondering, Maria, are there comparable club competitions that we can benchmark this across to see how this is performing against other women's game club competitions?
Yes, so in the US, the NWSL agreed a slate of deals to last from 2024 to 2027 and hailed this to be, a 40 times increase from their previous deals. It was first reported that these deals with CBS, ESPN, Amazon, and ION were worth around $60 million per year. Sport Business Media then reported last year that the real value in terms of the total cash component is worth in the region of $20 to $25 million per year. The league itself disputed that, and Sport Business Media also reported that about 35 to 40 million of that big 60 million number actually comes from value in kind, with marketing, with promotion and production subsidies and things like that. But actually what it comes down to, I think, is that the fact that women's sports in the US in general, I think, have a lot more room in terms of pure financial values to grow to get to where the men's sports are in the US, just because of how much rights are worth across the board in the US. And B, I think it could actually harm them in the future. They were hailed to get such a big deal, and then what happens in their newest rights negotiations? Anything smaller, anything below that, and it would be seen as plateauing growth. What's happening to NWSL? What's happening to women's football? So obviously, if you're looking at that 25 million number or the 60 million number, that's still some ways above what the Women's Champions League is clocking in at. But I don't think it should be a compare and contrast for a couple of reasons. One of them is that the Champions League is an international club competition, which means that it has to draw interest from all sorts of countries with varying levels of interest in women's football and varying levels of success of investment in and viewership of women's football. And secondly, I think Women's Champions League also, I think, has a tougher battle to fight as the men's competition is so established and popular across the board in Europe. In the US, MLS, which is, the men's football counterpart to NWSL, still way below the level of popularity such as NHL, MLB, NBA. And so women's sports and women's football, I think, in the US have fit itself quite neatly into a very specific niche of the US sports culture. And I think it helps it get that value as well. And, those deals in the US were also negotiated by IMG and WME, who certainly know their way around the US sports market as well.
This is the National Women's Soccer League. This is the top domestic football league in the US that we're talking about.
That's right. Yes.
Under these new deals, who's going to be showing them, and what kind of media partners do they have in the US?
Yeah, so in the US, they have CBS, ESPN, Amazon, and ION, which is kind of, the traditional US model of splitting up sports into different packages, especially for the WNBA. That's been quite successful. And then the NWSL recently announced that they have a new deal with streaming platform Victory Plus, and that kind of came up as a result of expansion of the league. So they have some new teams, so they have more games. They're able to create another package, and so they'll have an extra 32 games next season because they have 2 new expansion teams.
So does each of those media partners have narrow exclusivity, say like in a particular day? Or we're not talking simulcast here, we're talking about each partner will have some level of exclusivity?
Yeah, so all the games are split more or less equally in terms of who gets what. ESPN has 20 games, CBS has 21, Amazon has 27, and then 50 of them actually are on free to air on that ION deal with Scripps. And so, those are kind of split pretty much how, say the WNBA does it, as I mentioned before. And I think that's part of what helps them get that value up as well, because everyone wants a piece of the pie. Everyone wants to get into women's football, say that they're supporting women's football. And I think that helps them for sure as well.
That, as you said, that's a very kind of American approach, having multiple partners, each having narrow exclusivity. I'm wondering, Imran, what are we learning from this new deal, or these new set of deals, I should say, about what UEFA's thinking is? Because every rights holder in every sport always has the same starting point. They have to find the right balance for reach and revenue. And according to where the event is or the sports property is in the stage of its evolution. Typically, developing properties will favor reach over revenue and more mature properties, vice versa. What is UEFA's thinking currently about this property? How is it approaching that question?
I think UEFA and broadcasters learned a lot from DAZN's experience. DAZN had the rights over the previous 4 seasons. There was a view before Disney sealed the deal that this would be very exposure led, like you're saying, reach rather than revenue in terms of the media rights deal. And for some, Disney Plus, therefore, was a little bit surprising for the main market of Europe. I think what we've got to remember is Disney Plus has around 40 million subscribers across Europe. And I think both Disney and UEFA and the clubs believe that the kind of people who like this property and crucially will grow to like this property will become dedicated fans, viewers, when there's more discoverability for this property, are to be found on Disney Plus. There's a full marketing machine, a wider entertainment ecosystem that I think was attractive to UEFA as well as the rights fee. Obviously, the sponsorship factor is still very important. UEFA, our sister title, Sport Business Sponsorship, has reported very well on this about UEFA's plans for women's football, about how they've generated, I think, close to 100 million euros in the last 4-year cycle. That's across all its women's football properties, not just the Women's Champions League. They want to double. That's the plan for the next 5 years. And they've reconfigured the packages. Some have already extended or heightened their commitment. I think Amazon, Pepsi, just some of those were already signed up into the new cycle. So the sponsorship angle, very important and some big targets there. But I think the media-wise, Disney Plus has a lot of exposure. And of course, there's the EBU and free-to-air broadcaster angle as well, which is providing that sort of one game a week. It's not as simple as that because, for some of these European free-to-air broadcasters, it's difficult for them to commit in prime time to one match per week. But having said that, there is also the EBU streaming service, which can provide some coverage.
We're used to, when we're talking about UEFA, we've become used to, when we're talking about the club deals, we've been used to talking about team marketing, the national team games, CA11. On this property, UEFA is working with two circles. That seems to be a different approach to that historical approach of relying everything on team and CA11. What is Two Circles' role? How did that come about?
Well, Two Circles already had the sponsorship rights deal with UEFA. I think that since November 2020, they were working on that. I think pretty successful, according to most people we've spoken to on that sponsorship remit. When it came up to who was going to get the media remit, a number of people were interested from what we hear. I think Two Circles were able to show that they were able to sort of join everything up and be more cohesive, that the sponsorship stuff would be taken care of, so they want full commercial rights. But the media rights side, they started to hire. Of course, I think, again, going back to last year's Sportel was when they confirmed they'd acquired Spring Media, and that really built out their sort of media rights sales as well. Some sort of high-profile media rights people coming on board. I think, again, Two Circles are able to bring those relationships, but also bring a sort of, I guess, the data angle is where, they were known for many years as sort of the data experts. And I think they were able to bring that to the party when they managed to get the rights deal.
I want to come on to Disney. You mentioned Disney and what they're doing. I think there's a lot we can talk about, but just in parenthesis, I'd like to try and understand a little bit about why the incumbent lost the rights. DAZN had the global rights in the cycle 21-24. For me, this is interesting, putting the whole thing in the context of women's football generally and media rights. I was thinking back when we were preparing for this podcast, I was thinking back to that time around the spring 2023 when Gianni Infantino had a very public spat with broadcasters in Europe about the value of the Women's World Cup. They were lowballing. I've got the phrase that he said here. He said that the broadcasters, and he was talking particularly about public service broadcasters, he said they have a duty to promote and invest in women's sport. And I was thinking about that, and it reminded me of something DAZN said. In November 2021, I went up to Milan, to DAZN's production facility up there, to interview Veronica Di Quattro, who was the global revenue officer for DAZN at the time. And we spoke about many different things, about Serie A and about DAZN generally. But there's one thing that really stuck in my mind, was that Veronica talked about DAZN as a company having a real commitment to developing women's sport. I made a note of exactly the things she said, which was in our article. And I think it's interesting in the context. Gianni Infantino was very heavily criticized by people in the industry when he talked about broadcasters paying a fair fee and having a duty to women's sport. A lot of people at the time said, well, hang on, Gianni, this is a market. Things have a commercial value. Broadcasters pay the commercial value, etc., etc. This is what Veronica said in November 2021. She said, and this was actually in the wake of doing the deal for the Women's Champions League. She said, it is definitely a strong statement of our commitment to give visibility and support to women's sport in general. We think it helps create a virtuous circle that we need to implement. Broadcasters have a responsibility in that. Unless you give visibility to this content, it is not going to be able to attract investment and resources from brands and sponsors and so on. It's not going to be able to invest in talent development and growth. We do really believe that needs to be changed because we know how many passionate fans there are for women's sport. We wanted to take a very strong stand in this regard. Now, I've been told informally, and I've got no idea if this is true or not, I've been told informally that Len Blavatnik, the owner of Access that owns DAZN, was a real driver in that deal. He really wanted that deal. And so it's interesting. This is a pay television broadcast, which at the time was hemorrhaging money, which was talking about this developmental, this almost ideological commitment to women's sport. So 4 years down the line, they've lost the property. So I'm just wondering, Imran, in the conversations that you've had, what did you pick up about what DAZN's thinking? Are they rowing back from this commitment, or is it just a purely a commercial decision?
No, I remember that time well. I think when they did this deal for UEFA Women's Champions League, I spoke to Guy Laurent Epstein of UEFA. I spoke to, I think, Laura Louisi, who was then at DAZN, now I think is at the NFL. And there was a lot of optimism. I mean, if you think, you and Marie were talking about this earlier, the real growth of this property, there was a time when the women's final would be on in the same city as the men's final, I think the night before, in a much smaller stadium. You compare that to this year, Arsenal beating Barcelona, which was enjoyed very much by our producers and Lumi listening in on this. And, the massive parade, of course, afterwards back here in London. The group stage was, I think, introduced in 2021 for the time of that deal. And now we have a new sort of expanded format for this season, 18 teams and then a playoff round and so on. So there has been that growth, and DAZN coming in at that stage was part of that growth. And they thought it would be a subscription property. And I think ultimately, over the 4 years, it turned out not to be. The initial plan was 2 years, get the exposure, lots free on YouTube, and then keep that paywall pretty high. Ultimately, that didn't transpire. They basically offered it for free, did sub-licensing deals as well to try and get as much exposure. It wasn't being paid for, and it wasn't ultimately being watched in the numbers, either on DAZN or even their YouTube channel that they'd hoped. You're right, more broadly, I think DAZN, they're criticized for this often, but I think they should have some credit to. They do pivot quickly. They do change tack. You've written in depth about this, I think most recently with the Club World Cup acquisition and indeed the Foxtel acquisition, whether on DAZN 5.0, 6.0, I'm not sure. But certainly women's football was once part of their thinking very strongly. Multiple properties, for example, Liga F in Spain as well. That isn't the case anymore, though I think they did renew Liga F in Spain as it happened. And again, they thought it was a subscription driver, and in the end, it turned out to be not a subscription driver. They used their fast channels, but their thinking changed based on what they were getting. You mentioned the Disney angle, and I think we'll talk a bit in depth about that. But Disney, what they think they're getting out of this, I think they saw a sort of rare opportunity to secure a major women's football property, multinational, drawing interest across the board, but with strong appeal to its core subscriber base. Now, some people we spoke to talked about this as being a sort of a subscriber acquisition tool. I think a lot of people said that that's unlikely to happen. There won't be a huge uptick based on this property alone. More likely it sort of serve as a powerful addition to the wider content offering. You think also of Disney picking out La Liga rights in the UK, that one game a week, Saturday night. It's not really purely based on that. It's based on the wider offering. I mean, even in my own household, for example, I'm interested in these sports rights and might make me keep my subscription. My son watches his Star Wars and Marvel and so on. So I think, again, rounding out the family offering is part of it.
I'd like to ask you both, actually. I mean, both as not just football fans, but as people who talk about sports media, who write about deals, who understand the way the sector works. And I'm probably going to get in trouble here, but I mean, my feeling is that And it kind of confirms what you're saying, Imran, about the Zone's experience. My feeling is Disney Plus is a paid television service. And my feeling is that the Women's Champions League at the moment is not a driver of subscriptions. And I just wanted to get your personal take, personal opinion on that. Maria, what's your feeling?
Think it for sure doesn't move the needle. I don't think anyone disagrees with that. It's just not one of those things where, they get the property and then suddenly people are lining up trying to buy subscriptions. Like, I don't think that's realistic at all. And I don't think anyone thinks that. The one thing I will say about this that I think is interesting is that there is a subsect, I think, from kind of observation. I think there's a subsect of sports fans that are specifically fans of women's football that don't necessarily watch men's football or don't necessarily watch other things. And so for that reason, I think it makes sense to kind of make it into its own thing. And there will be people, I think, who would be flocking to now Disney or whatever to watch the Women's Champions League because that is what they are interested in. But then again, that can be really said for any sport. So I don't think it moves the needle. That's not to say that in the future that might change, but I think right now it's not one of those things that people, lining up around the block because, oh, look, Disney have the Women's Champions League now.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to agree. And Imran, I mean, you mentioned this thing about the family appeal. That feels to me more like something that is acquired to prevent churn rather than necessarily to drive new subscribers. I mean, what's your take on that?
I think that's right. And in a way, that's reflected in the rights fee. As you said earlier, it's a doubling, well, more than a doubling. But in absolute terms, we're ultimately talking around 12 million euros a year for Disney, massive global company. Largely, that's a drop in the ocean. You've reported on the UEFA Men's Champions League rights. I think in the Big Five alone in this current cycle, they're worth over 2 billion euros per season, just the European Big Five. Will Disney come in and get the Champions League at some point? We'll have to wait and see on that in a market like the UK. For this, you're right. It rounds out the offering. I don't think it's going to move the needle on subscriptions. And that's the same with their very selective deal to get the Saturday night La Liga game in the UK. I don't think hardcore La Liga fans are going to sign up just for that. But it's the kind of thing that someone like me, at the end of the month, looking whether to cancel or not, will think, oh, well, let's give it another month.
Yeah, I mean, I'm always interested whenever I see a Disney sports deal because I think I have a selective memory on this because my recollection is that writing about Disney outside of the US and ESPN in particular, that it's had a fairly checkered history outside the US. I mean, I remember writing about the joint venture with Murdoch in Asia breaking up. The ESPN Classic and ESPN America channels basically didn't really move the needle enormously in Europe. They tried in the UK with the premium service. They had Premier League, and in the end, that didn't really work. But because I was slightly concerned that my take on Disney outside the US was negatively affected by one or two stories that we did over the years. I had a chat this morning with Murray Barnett, who I'm sure you know from World Rugby, Formula One, NBA, DAZN even. Murray worked for ESPN for 11 years. So I thought, who better to get a take on the overall strategy outside of the US? And there were two or three things that Murray said to me that were kind of take away from the conversation. The first thing was that you have to remember when we're talking about any of these deals, that ESPN is primarily an American company, and all of its activities outside of the US represent a tiny, tiny fraction of its turnover. So all of these things, I mean, when it comes to sports rights, the ESPN priorities were the US, the US, the US, and then way after everything else. So I think that's an important context. The second thing that he mentioned is that basically a lot of what ESPN was doing in the rest of the world was based on the fact that when they were doing these big deals for US sport with the US Sports League, they were picking up as part of the deals global rights for a lot of these properties. What that meant is that they were able to go around the world and put together very low-cost channels because they didn't have to pay an additional local fee for the rights. They had the rights. So a lot of the channels that they had around the world, linear channels, ESPN in various territories, they were ticking over, making a small profit margin, massive, but they were doing their job. And the third thing was that outside of the US, their approach was very opportunistic. And they would look at the market, they would look at the distribution deals that were available, they would look at what the cost would be. And one of the things that Murray said is that in that period of the 2000s into the 2010s, when there was a huge inflation in the value of sports rights, generally, globally, a lot of these deals just didn't make sense. They would run the numbers. They would be very careful. They would go into different territories and different markets, and they would only invest where it made sense, where they could see there being a margin, where they could see being a profit. And with that rights inflation, they stepped back from a lot of territories. Now, what I'm wondering now with Disney Plus is, do you think now Disney Plus obviously is different to ESPN? It's not a linear channel, it's a global streaming platform. Do you think now, are you getting a sense that there is a clear global strategy to sports rights, Imran? Because, I mean, we talked about the value of the deals in absolute terms. La Liga in the UK, not enormous. Women's Champions League, not enormous. But they have also acquired the Champions League rights in two of the Nordic countries, Sweden and Denmark, I think. Now, the last time those rights went to market, Nent, I think it was in Denmark, the total value for those two countries for the Champions League was over 125, 130 million euros a season. That is a very substantial investment in a very localized territory. So I'm just wondering, maybe it's early days, but are we getting a picture of how sport fits into this, what in my mind is kids and entertainment platform? Do you think now they know what they're doing globally with sports rights, Imran?
I think, you've reported very well on Amazon in the past, Frank, and about how they're, again, very selective. It's a very market-specific strategy they'll have, which is related to their wider main core business, and the sports acquisitions will serve that, data and customs, etc. Disney is, of course, a very different company to Amazon, but I think it's a similar approach. Like you said, the Nordics will have their own rationale for some pretty valuable rights. UEFA Women's Champions League across Europe, La Liga in the UK. I think it's important to say, though, that, when two circles talking to Disney, what I understand is, they were very keen to hear that Disney was still looking at other sports rights. And of course, they were vindicated on that because Disney subsequently acquired that La Liga package. We'll keep looking at other things. And I think they wanted to make sure the UEFA Women's Champions League wasn't isolated on Disney cross-continentally as a sports property. That's the only sports thing there. They wanted a much wider package. I think also, you're right, even with the UEFA Club competition rights you talk about in the Nordics, these are not huge numbers for Disney at the moment. I slightly frivolously mentioned Marvel Entertainment and Star Wars earlier. The IP on those, though, is multi-billions, of course, and when Disney acquired those in the last, I think maybe 10, 15 years, both of those. So sports still is small. I think it would be a real surprise if Disney was to come in for a bid for the really top-tier properties outside of the US.
Okay, so I mean, just to round off, I think I don't want to try to address the whole of women's football in this topic. I think there are very good podcasts out there that deal with women's football, women's sport, and I don't want to try and compete with those. But I do think it'd be useful to see if we can find something to say about the media rights value generally for women's football, if it's going up, if it's going down. I remember in March this year that Deloitte published a report which was talking about the commercial value of women's sport generally. And they projected revenues. I think they said revenues for 2024 were 1.88 billion, and that was double the previous year. And they projected 2.35 billion for this year, for 2025. So there are analysts and experts out there running the data on women's sport, and the picture generally seems to be one of growth. And within that, women's football. But at the same time, every time I go on LinkedIn, I find people saying, oh, it's all hype. The numbers don't back it up. The audiences aren't there. So, Maria, I wanted to get your take on this. Are there any other, we talked about the US League. Are there any other properties that might be benchmarks or might be things we could take a look at, which either confirm this trend of an increase or challenge this trend?
So the one interesting deal, in my opinion, to look at here is the EBU's deal for the Women's Euros that happened this summer. It was the first time the women's competition was tendered separately to the men's or to any other competition. And I actually think it's a success story if you really look at it, because, that deal includes 34 territories, including Germany and the UK, which are two very big markets. And that was worth just under 40 million euros across all those territories for the competition this summer. And you can't really compare that to any previous deals, as the UK and Germany previously had their own deals and the EBU had an agreement that included other competitions. But from having spoken to the market, that deal is generally understood to be an increase on the previous allocations for those markets and this competition. And also, having spoken to the market while reporting on the story, I think a big issue, and this extends, I think, to the Women's Champions League as well, is that all these European territories are just in such completely different places when it comes to women's football. how many people watch, how much broadcasters are willing to shell out, the level of priority that's given to women's football. And I think that actually makes it quite tough to negotiate these deals. And of course, when you look at what happened in 2023, as you mentioned, Frank, I think this went much better. Ahead of the 23 Women's World Cup, there was almost a blackout, like you said, in the big five markets in Europe. And then, FIFA was saying that they felt the broadcasters were undervaluing the sport. The EBU basically had to come in and create a peace deal to make sure that it was on TV. And I think the lessons learned from what happened in 2023 will go a long way going forward. I think all the players need to understand that, yes, there is a lot of room for women's football to grow, but you can't really create artificial growth or artificial interest or artificial money. I think less black and white thinking, this has to be worth XYZ just because it's women's football, and truly assessing market by market is important here for both club and national competitions in the future. I do want to note, though, that this is not the case across the board. We understand that Netflix has made a very hefty investment for the rights to the Women's World Cup in 2027 and 2031 in the US and Canada. From what I understand, this, trumped any other traditional broadcaster's bid and trumps any other valuation for women's football competitions in the US. So, maybe streamers and FIFA have found a match for one another there.
I think it's very much the start, Frank. I mean, you look at Real Madrid had to play in the UEFA Women's Champions League qualifiers this year. Imagine them having to qualify for the main Champions League. Another team, by the way, also had to was Manchester United, dear to your heart. That's the first time they've reached the main draw. So I think we're very much seeing the start of this. I've heard Peter Hutton, the great sports media exec, speak a couple of times about, I think it was someone when he was at Meta in the marketing team, talk about the age of 10 to 14, what someone falls in love with then, they'll fall in love with their whole life. For you, that might have been the aforementioned Manchester United. I think what the clubs, what the property, what UEFA will hope for on Disney Plus, because of, again, that discoverability, is some boy, girl, whatever it is, watching something else might see that that's on. The parents might see, oh, let's watch that game, and fall in love with the property and the game that way, perhaps.
Well, for the record, I was 4 when I started supporting United, but I think that's a good moment to round it up on. So thanks, Imran. Thanks, Maria, for your input and insight. Very informative. I learned a lot today. For those of you listening at home on your wireless set, if you'd like to know more about the rights deals for women's football or to access the world's biggest database of media rights deals, you can either go on the website at Sport Business or you can write to info@sportbusiness.com. So thank you for listening and enjoy the rest of your day.